in defense cooperation at the turn of century. Now, the United States has become one of our most important defense partners.
The relationship with India really cross-cuts all sectors, public and private, whether it's economy, science, engineering, emerging tech. So, I mean, there's just an awful lot of cross-pollination here in trade and tech that I just think augurs really, really well for this partnership going forward.
When I first visited the U.S. as a Prime Minister, India was the 10th largest economy in the world. Today, India is the 5th largest economy. In modern India, women are leading us to a better future. India grows while being responsible about our planet. We became the only G20 country to meet its Paris commitment. We protected our people with 2.2 billion doses of made in India COVID vaccines, and that too free cost. लोकतंत्र हमारा स्पिरिट है, लोकतंत्र हमारे रगों में है, लोकतंत्र को हम जीते हैं, लोकतंत्र के मूलभूत मूल्यों को आधार लेकर के बने हुए संविधान के आधार पर चलती है। जब आप डेमोक्रेसी कहते हैं, जब डेमोक्रेसी को स्वीकार करते हैं और जब हम डेमोक्रेसी को लेकर के जीते हैं, तब डिस्क्रिमिनेशन का कोई सवाल ही नहीं उठता है।
Thank you for tuning into our special coverage, Modi in America. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's 3-day maiden state visit to the U.S. has been a power-packed trip. One touted as new chapter and a new turning point in the Indo-U.S. relationship. Perhaps also because as Asia's other emerging power, India could act as a crucial counterweight to Chinese influence, both in the region and outside it. One significant reason why Washington has been courting New Delhi with gusto. And now President Joe Biden has grand plans to cement the US position in the Indo-Pacific, one which encompasses not just South Asia, even East and the Western Pacific. One that was apparent through a range of diplomatic, technological and security initiatives signed between Washington, D.C. and New Delhi. The fact that the India-US relationship has come a long way since the Cold War era is what stands out all the way from Nehru to Modi in 2023. What's different in New Delhi and Washington's calculus this time round? Let's find out as I introduce my esteemed panelists to you today. I'm joined in by former Republican Congressman Bob McKeeven. I'm also joined in by Bradley Shaw, who's an author, Tekendra Parmar, who's a tech editor of Insider, and Nicole Brenner-Schmitz, who's a Democrat strategist. Many thanks to you, ladies and gentlemen, for, in fact, joining me. Nicole being the only lady, not ladies. In fact, let me begin with former Congressman Bob McKeeven. Bob, President Biden has characterized the India-US relationship as a next-generation partnership. Would you agree?
I certainly do. And as you know, there is a great affection that the American people hold for the people of India. Our relationship is across the board. It's the Indian Americans are the second largest, second only to Mexican American first-generation immigrants. If you go to Silicon Valley, more than half of the major top dozen or so technology companies are headed by Indian Americans. I think the relationship and friendship is very, very strong, and I'm convinced that it will play a major part, whichever way it goes, in the years ahead.
Right. Nicole, if I could bring you in, while we speak, on the right side of our screens, we have some heartwarming visuals of Vice President Kamala Harris and, of course, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, accompanied by the Indian Prime Minister at that State Department luncheon, where not just Antony Blinken, but also Kamala Harris spoke about the contribution that's been made by the Indian American community to the United States. It was heartwarming to, in fact, hear of the Samosa Caucus when she spoke about that grouping of Indian American congressmen. How far has the U.S. Congress come in terms of welcoming the contribution of the Indian American community?
Well,
yeah, I mean,
perhaps one of the
Bob, that question is for Nicole.
demonstrate-
That question's for Nicole. I'll come to you.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's certainly a rising electorate that, electeds are paying more and more attention to, and we're seeing more and more Indian Americans be elected to city councils and state legislatures and to the United States Congress. The reality is that in the United States political action committees, which are our PACs, and how elected officials raise money is an important element to our politics, and we're seeing that they're having a more powerful influence on the fundraising base of not just Indian Americans who are elected, but other elected officials. So yeah, we're seeing that political power grow and grow.
Tikinder, we've seen announcements of deals on jet engine, tech transfers, very importantly, semiconductors, even drones, and cooperation in space. We know that this is one area that is not going to grow overnight, but are India and the United States now on the right trajectory?
Yeah, I think the way to look at these technology deals is we're in the opening game of a new Cold War between the USA and China. And in the backdrop of that, these deals are essential to both U.S. interests and Indian interests. So when it comes to semiconductors, removing American and Western reliance from China, when it comes to the mining of essential minerals that are found in China, moving those things to India, moving manufacturing to India is going to have a big impact on both the economies of the U.S. and India.
Absolutely. Bradley, if I could bring you in on this, you're an expert in, tapping into demographic changes, and we are talking at a time when India has already overtaken China as being one of the, being the most populous nation in the world. How can the United States now capitalize on that shift?
Well, of course, India and the United States are both still growing countries. In fact, India is on schedule to grow by about 200 million people over the course of the next 20 or 30 years, while China is expected to contract by the same amount. So India and the United States are still growing markets, and growing markets that are open and free are very important. So yes, I do think the United States sees India as a major partner, not just in the pursuit of democracy around the world, but also in the pursuit of developing growing marketplaces for consumer goods.
Right. Congressman Bob, I'm sorry I interrupted you back then, but in your years of experience, I'm sure you can draw that sharp contrast between, the relationship that perhaps we witnessed between India and the United States decades ago. It goes all the way back to the Cold War era. And now cut to 2023, when we've seen, this state visit of Prime Minister Modi is being billed as a turning point in the Indo-U.S. relationship. How far have we come?
Well, I think that's a very good question. In the bipolar world, when you were one or the other, we, of course, were very concerned that India was very close to Russia and to China during those years of the 1960s and 70s. But as we've moved into a multipolar world, and as you see the growth and expansion and acceleration of India, our relationships, I think, have gotten closer and closer. In fact, I was just thinking of the 5 major candidates for president of the United States in the Republican Party. 2 of them are Indian Americans. Their parents were immigrants. I think there's just a tremendous desire for an assimilation and a growth and agreement between the 2 of us, economically, politically, and otherwise. And that remains to be seen, because we saw what the tradition was, that sometimes India was closer to China. But I think that right now they are playing a major leading role on their own. And I see only an improved relationship between the 2 of us. and freedom in general.
Absolutely. And that is the fact that it was also highlighted by Vice President Kamala Harris during that address at the luncheon, at the State Department luncheon, when she said that this is the first time that the U.S. Congress is witnessing a record number of Indian American politicians as well. Having said that, let me quickly bring in our managing editor, Zaka Jacob, who is also joining me live right now from the United States. He's been very closely covering Prime Minister's visit. Zaka, you look tired, but I know there's a lot to talk about. Having said that, take us through how Prime Minister Modi has very skillfully utilized soft power, whether it is that of Indian culture or people-to-people connections, to in fact very skillfully gain those hard outcomes that the state visit was meant to achieve.
Well, let's talk about those hard outcomes. Of course, the jet engine deal is being talked about. Predator drones are being talked about. So those are, concrete outcomes of this visit. While you see the pomp and the ceremony and the grandeur and all these luncheons and dinners, right, where, there's a lot of words used to describe, the future of India and U.S. relationship, the bonhomie, the friendship, and the limitless potential and all that. I think underlying this visit is a realization, both in New Delhi as well as in Washington, that these two countries need each other. The world is changing. It is rapidly evolving. You have the Russia-Ukraine war on the one side. You have an increasingly assertive and aggressive China on the other. And whether by the consequence of this war or otherwise, the fact is that Russia and China are going to be seen as a camp. And you have this other camp, which is the United States and its NATO allies. The war in Ukraine has been going on for the better part of the last year and a half. But if you actually look at it, which is that country which can act as a counterbalance to China, a country which already has its own set of troubles with China, and a country that economically, militarily, in the long term, could potentially challenge China, and that is only India. So I think for both the United States and India, the big underlying theme that will emerge out of this visit is whether it is in the field of space technology, in the field of defense technology, even in something as simple as, opening new consulates, making consular access easier for their citizens. The underlying theme is going to be that this relationship, both of these countries, their leaderships are invested in each other because they need to. This ever-growing complex geopolitical dynamic, which is ever-changing, the only way they can be on top of it is by investing in each other, is by complementing each other, and it's by holding each other's hand, really, and moving forward, not just in the next 5 or 10 years. This is not a near-term game. This is a game that's going to be played out over the next 3 decades, maybe. And the question that was before the leadership and the peoples of both India and America is, are we going to hold each other's hand and go forth for the next 2 or 3 decades? And I think the answer to that question across multiple events through this visit, across multiple platforms, multiple speeches, and even different people who spoke about it, I think the answer to that question is yes, that time has come.
Absolutely. And when you say that time has come, is there anything right now that is limiting U.S.-India relationship right now, even if it were to counter China? Because remember, so far, the U.S.-India relationship was one that was also accompanied by a great level of skepticism. Has India's non-aligned stance overall in the changing geopolitical dynamics been a hurdle? And has Prime Minister Modi's state visit been able to sort of navigate that hurdle?
So if you speak to, let's say a Dr. Jaishankar or anybody who is sort of helming Indian foreign policy, they would say that, we left non-aligned back a long time ago. So then if you ask them, how would you describe India's foreign policy right now? The word that they prefer is multi-aligned or multipolar. So, for example, that means that India and the United States can have very, very deep engagement, but at the same time, India will take a differing position on Ukraine. India will continue to buy Russian oil. That, to my mind, is an example of being multi-aligned or multipolar. So I think India is very clear. While, yes, 90-95% of the areas, there is great degree of convergence. This is the relationship for the future. This is the relationship for the long term. And frankly, to be honest, given India's own problems with China, at its current military capabilities, I don't think it's in a position to take on China on its own. So it needs to have, partners and allies and friends with whom it can collaborate to be able to take on China. That is one critical aspect. The other critical aspect is, like you said, are there limits to this partnership? I wouldn't want to call it limits, but certainly there are, divergences. There are areas where both countries may not necessarily agree. Russia-Ukraine is one example, but even on the question of democracy and human rights, I mean, India's record it may not be perfect. America's record is not perfect. And I think there is an acknowledgement by both sides that you can have these difficult conversations. You can have these conversations where, views don't align. And one of that, I think, happens to be this whole question of India's track record and Mr. Modi's government's track record when it comes to treatment of minorities, etc. I think that's a question that was asked of the Prime Minister.
Right.
It's a question that was asked of the President, and they both dealt with it in their own way.
Absolutely. Many thanks to you, Zaka, for joining us live and sharing those precious inputs.